So today's presentation is called What's This PDF? And so it's about the difference between preprints, Epubs, author manuscripts, version of record. So sometimes you just find a PDF online and you're not necessarily sure how authoritative it is or what on earth it is really. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about that. I'll hopefully try to demystify some of that for you today. And if we have time, we'll get into some other types of PDFs that you might find online as well. So today, basically, at the end of this, you'll be able to explain the differences between preprints, Epubs, author manuscripts, and the version of record. And you'll be able to identify key features that would help you categorize a PDF that you find online. So I think, Katie, we were going to do a poll really quickly just to see what everyone's kind of affiliation is and what your, Okay, so it looks like primarily librarians, faculty, staff. Okay, so these are our results. Okay, so we'll go ahead and move on to the next one. So from one of my favorite webcomics, XKCD, this is the benefits of saying just a PDF, because then you don't have to explain what's a preprint, an unpublished study, uploaded to a preprint server, but which has not undergone peer review. And so the benefits of saying it's just a PDF is it avoids any implications about whether it's published or not published. Does putting it online count as publication? It raises questions about the authors, and it still implies this document was probably prepared by a professional because no normal human trying to communicate in 2020 would choose this ridiculous format, which I do find hilarious and also true. So we're going to be looking a little bit about what different kinds of PDFs you might find are. So first we'll have just kind of a quick overview of the publishing process in theory. Or in the old days, you would do your scientific research, you would answer a question or observe something new, write up the article manuscript, submit the manuscript for peer review, and then the article would be published in a journal. And of course, this was initially when it was print, and so you didn't have a lot of different versions wandering around. The version that was published in the journal would be published in the journal, and most other sort of forms of communication or dissemination were much more informal, like just letters to colleagues and so forth. But then the publishing landscape changed. I don't know if you've heard of this newfangled thing called the internet, but journals started moving to online publishing. And with that came a lot of changes in how works were disseminated. You started also seeing a rise of a lot of open access initiatives. So once people found that they could get information very readily on the internet, they wanted more information available. They wanted it more and they wanted it for free. And especially in terms of research that received federal or state funding, they're like, hey, we helped pay to get this research done. Our money helped fund this research, so we should really be able to see those results. And so you started seeing a lot of open access initiative, and this kind of falls into two categories, which is green open access, which is self-archiving. So you would put a copy of a version of it on a repository somewhere, whether that was like your own author website or a university website, if your university had a repository, or there were different repositories that came out as this was going on. And then gold open access is that the official version that was published would be open access and would be freely available, freely readable. And so it's sort of a born open access, kind of, if you want to describe it that way. And then another major change that really helped push there to be more open access, but also pushed a little bit more of this confusion, was the NIH public access policy in 2008, which stated that any article or research that received NIH funding had to deposit a copy in PubMed Central within 12 months of when the journal article was published. Again, on the grounds that the public is paying for the research, they should be able to see or view a version of the results of that research. And then there started to be a more widespread adoption of preprint servers. And we'll get a little bit into what that is, but this kind of started with the physics community, which would put them online for peer review, and also as a way to get more information out there more quickly. And so the NIH public access policy sort of established PubMed Central, and so that's a version of green open access, because PubMed Central is a repository within PubMed where the full text of these articles is posted. And so once one of the big major funders in the sphere started doing that, there started being a lot more push toward open access and a lot more different types of dissemination. So now what the publishing workflow might look like, you might write the manuscript. You might choose optionally to upload it to a preprint server as an author prior to submitting it to a journal for peer review. The journal might actually upload an earlier version to their website. So once they've accepted it, but before they do any of the main kind of formatting, copy editing, and the sort of last minute tidying up, so to speak. So before they've assigned it to an issue number, as they would do in the print, they would just upload it online first. Then the final version gets assigned to an issue, and that's there. And then the author can also choose, after it is published, to upload it, a version of it, to a repository. And depending on whether the publisher lets them publish the full version to a repository, most don't. So usually what they would be uploading would be the accepted author version. So once they've made the revisions and it's been accepted, so the accepted version would typically be what they would upload if they do choose to do that. So you can see that there are 3 different kind of new places where you might see a version of what the author was writing about. And so this can lead to some confusion. So talking a little bit about a preprint. So a preprint is a scholarly manuscript posted by the authors in an openly accessible platform, usually before or sometimes in parallel with the peer review process. And so this is different from e-print or an author manuscript, which are peer reviewed and accepted for publication, but published online before the official journal publication. So you might think, well, why would you want to do that, or how did this come about? So this started with, as I mentioned before, the physics world. The Los Alamos National Laboratory for Physics established arXiv back in 1991. In 2001, it was moved to Cornell, and it was added on some additional disciplines. And then the biological sciences started getting into it in about 2013, in the grounds of making the research more quickly disseminated. And then in 2016, NIH, Wellcome Trust, and other funders established ASAP Bio to try to sort of establish communities of best practices surrounding preprints and kind of consolidate all of the work that was being done into one location. And actually, if you do go to the ASAP Bio website, you can find a very large list of different preprint servers that are available. So the biology, the medical sciences didn't really start, medRxiv didn't really establish until 2019, but during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw a really huge increase in the number of preprints that were being published. And a lot of this is because journal publication takes a long time. Anyone who has published before can testify to that. So it can take, sometimes, up to a year or more, months to a year to get that information out there and published. And between when it's accepted and when it's published, that's a runtime of additional months. And so during a public health emergency, there was obviously a very big rush to try to get more information out there and available as quickly as possible. And the journals did their part to try to turn things around more quickly. But they're still, even with all that, there was just so much information that was being generated that there was no way that anyone could really keep up with it. So about 40% of the articles that were published during the COVID-19 pandemic through April 2020 were initially published as preprint. So they started their life as a preprint and were then later published through the traditional journal archiving. In medRxiv, there were 200 preprints on all topics by January 2020, and then 2,000 by May 2020. So this was a huge spike. 30,000 views in August 2019 to 6.1 million views. So a lot of people were looking at this. They were really trying to find information, see what type of information was out there. But only about 4 to 5% of these preprints were later published in traditional journals. So there was still a lot that was out there. And some may not have been published in a traditional journal either because they maybe the data wasn't particularly good or relevant, or it just wasn't competitive or novel enough. But sometimes the author may have just not necessarily wanted to do it, and putting it online in some form fulfilled what they wanted to accomplish in some cases. So why would you want to do this? Well, there are definitely some pros to preprints. One, the information is openly accessible to anyone with an internet connection. Once you have the data, it is really quickly available. And it can also establish the priority to prevent scooping. So you can basically, because once you post a preprint, you do have a digital object identifier, or DOI, that's associated with it. And the date that it's published is there online. So you can say, so if later somebody tries to claim your data or your research, you can establish that priority. And it can potentially prevent duplication of efforts as well. And this is also useful for evidence of progress for grant proposals, because again, sometimes you are doing a lot of work, you're doing the research, but the publication process is very slow, so you can't necessarily show that evidence. But this allows you to show it for grants. And then it does also have open comment and review, because again, anybody can see it, and you're opening it up to a broader audience than you might in a traditional journal. So you can actually get feedback from a much wider range of people than just the initial peer reviewers. However, there are definitely some cons to preprints. One is that they are not traditionally peer reviewed, so there is not that layer of vetting that can give people confidence that it has been seen by someone. Now, I will say that most preprint servers do at least spot check. They do usually do a quick spot check of the science of it before they post it, just kind of to see if it is relevant, but it is not the same as, it's more like a desk review than per se a traditional peer review, where you would get the revisions and the very thorough analysis of your arguments and your data. Standards and best practices are still emerging, especially in the biomedical sciences, because it is still comparatively new. So there can be a lot of confusion, and it's still emerging. It's all kind of new. Everyone's kind of figuring out how to best work this into their workflow, how much they want to count it toward different things. And of course, it can be confusing to the general public, as we saw in that XKCD comic. where, it's like, okay, there was a study, but, but it wasn't peer reviewed, but it was still done, how much level of credence should that be given? And to their credit, the preprint servers do usually try to make it clear that this shouldn't be relied on for, clinical data, that it hasn't been peer reviewed, that, you should take everything with a grain of salt, so that there might be fewer safeguards against bad or misleading data or research. So there are definitely those concerns. But of course, traditional peer review and traditional journal process also doesn't necessarily catch everything wrong. That's why we do still have retractions and so on. And there is good research that does language that does never get published. So the peer review process and the digital journal process, it's a vetting. It gives it kind of a vote of confidence, but it's never going to be a full substitute for your own judgment and your own analysis of the data itself and what the data says. So one way that you can identify a preprint, many of them have a web address that ends in RXIV or archive. So whether that's archive, bioarchive, medRxiv, anything like that, that is an indication that it is a preprint. A lot of times there will be a version posting date. They'll say this version of this was available online as of this date. And you can actually post multiple versions of preprints if you later do revise that. Some preprint servers do discourage that, but it does kind of show the evolution of the data if you do make changes. And sometimes you'll see wording such as preprint or not peer reviewed. And if there's just no journal information listed, that's an indication that it, wasn't published in a journal. It might be a preprint. So I can show you this from medRxiv. You can see medRxiv preprint. This version posted October 10th, 2022, not certified by peer review. So this is an example of a PDF from medRxiv for this particular study. So this is an example of what that might look like, what a preprint might look like. Every preprint has their own versions of it, but these are the types of things that you'd be looking for. You can identify an author manuscript, again, with language like accepted manuscript or author manuscript. Sometimes there will be a DOI link to a version of record. It will say, this is a version of a study that was published in X journal, here's the link. And then sometimes the website link is to a university, oftentimes state universities, like the University of California system has a very large repository. Public repositories like PubMed Central, although there are also others, there are also discipline repositories sometimes that will let you archive copies of that as well. So here's an example of what that looks like. You can see it's an accepted manuscript, an article published in Linguistics Vanguard on that date, and there's a link to the version of record, which we'll summarize later. So this is a link to the published version. So if you're looking at an author manuscript, you are looking at something that has been accepted, something that has been peer reviewed and revised, but may not have the final cleanup. So there may be differences between the author version and the official version. So you would always want to check that if you can, if that is available to you. But again, if it's not, for example, if it's in a journal that you don't have subscription access to, sometimes that might be the best that you can do. So this is an example in Google Scholar. So this is an example of the link to the version of record. And this is the one in scholarsphere.psu.edu. So this was from Pennsylvania State University. So you'd see that this is the version that's from the repository compared to the publisher PDF. So sometimes you'll be able to see and tell that way when you're looking at it, that that's an author manuscript. And then identifying an EPUB. This is sort of online ahead of print. The link's available from the journal website, and you might see word like EPUB, published online, in press, online ahead of print, something like that. And it will contain the journal name, but no volume or issue number because it hasn't been given an official publication date, because the journals do still do the volumes and issues to mimic the print cycle of publication, despite the fact that they're continuing to put that out sooner. So this will be online, and it'll list the full publication for acceptance date. So here's an example of one from Nature. It says accelerated article preview. It has the accepted date, and you can see that in the citation, it does not include, it includes a DOI, but it doesn't include a volume or issue number because there hasn't been one yet. It hasn't been assigned to volume or issue. And then this is another example. You can see the received and accepted date below the article title and author name. And up at the top, you can see the name of the journal and a DOI, but that it does not have any volume or issue numbers assigned to it. So you can see that this is an online ahead of print. So they're just doing this to get the information out there more quickly in the interest of disseminating the information. And then the version of record is going to be from the journal website. It might include journal or publisher branding. It will include the DOI, and it will also include the volume or issue number that's available. So you can see the difference between this. You know, it has the publisher branding, Taylor Francis. It has the journal name, the date, volume, issue number, the page numbers as well, and the DOI and the original article. So you can see kind of the difference between the level of formatting. Sometimes the online ahead of prints look almost exactly like the original ones. Sometimes they are less formatted. It totally depends on the journal. But that's what you would be looking for, would be that the volume, the issue number, and the DOI, and that it wouldn't have the language saying that it was online ahead of print. So this is going to be the official version. If you can, this is usually what you want to try to cite, since that is the official vetted version of record. However, sometimes you don't have that, and you know, you should always cite whatever it is that you actually used, but you should do your best to get the version of record if you can. And now I'm going to go ahead and open it up to questions. I hope that this was helpful, but go ahead.
No, it was helpful, but I don't really have any questions.
Okay, wonderful. That's excellent. That's good to know. And I'll just mention one other thing that I didn't really have the time to add or get into, but other types of PDFs that you might find. Oh yes, Nerys, go ahead, please. You can unmute yourself.
There we go. So I'm just curious what people do what other librarians do when they get an article request, and what's most readily available is maybe not the version of record. Does that come up with anybody? What you provide? I mean, typically I'll provide what I can find and then say, yes, but keep in mind that this is this particular version.
Correct. And sometimes you're right, that is the best you can do. Sometimes, depending on, as long as you're getting it from a legitimate source, like a, you know, like an institutional repository, and not something like, you know, Sci-Hub.
Yes.
But yes, as long as you are getting that, and as long as you're including the appropriate caveats, because sometimes time is of the essence, and sometimes it is more important to get a version of the information depending on what is available, because yeah, sometimes you just don't have it, or it's going to take longer than they need, and time is of the essence, and so you get perhaps an author manuscript in a repository. Sometimes it's an EPUB, but yeah, and I think that does happen. And so sometimes you just have to say, here are the caveats, but this is what we can do. We can try to get you the version of record. And in most cases, the changes aren't major, but you do still, I'm sure that there are still some occasions where it is, where, something major does get caught, or there is some substantive change. But yeah, but I would say that for the most part, they're fairly comparable. It's mostly copy editing and formatting for the most part.
Yeah, that's kind of what I've been going on, but that was just my own opinion. So I wanted to run that by you.
Yeah, and I think it's an issue of what's best practice versus what's practical on the ground sometimes, because sometimes, you do have to weigh that, we can't get it, like with the COVID pandemic, sometimes it was just more information to get the information out there, get any information that was available as quickly as possible, and using your own judgment to make that assessment. So as long as you are aware of what something is and what it isn't and what its limitations are, you can make that, because sometimes there isn't good information or there isn't the best information, and sometimes the best information that you have available isn't ideal.
Exactly. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Other questions? All right, well, yeah. Oh yes, another question.
I'll just go ahead and ask another question. So then in the referencing, you need to stick with you need to be certain about what it actually is. So this is why it's important to be teaching our faculty about this for when they write their references, and then assist them with that particular version if they need help in preparing their reference list.
And the journal might refer them to say, hey, you want to cite the version of record. But again, what's most important for the communication is citing the version that you actually used.
Right. And I just wonder if that always occurs, but yes.
Yeah, and sometimes, and again, sometimes they will say, you need to cite the version of record. But yeah, you could, I don't know, even reach out to the author and be like, hey, did anything really change from the version of record if, you're not able to access it? For the most part, if it is a situation where you are doing a longer term project and you are publishing with it and you do have the time to get the version of record, so if it's you are spending the months writing that article, then there's not really necessarily an excuse not to take the time to get the version of record. However, if it's like you have a week, you're a student, you have a week to write a paper, and you don't necessarily have the time to interlibrary loan the version of record, then yes, cite what you actually used.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you everyone so much for attending. I hope that if you do get a winter break, that it is wonderful and restful. And if not, I hope you get something very soon, because everyone deserves rest and relaxation.